Hello there. Last time, I introduced you to the landmark Thucydides, which my Greek instructor recommended to me. I've never read Thucydides before, so when I went through the first video, I read paragraphs, what I thought were paragraphs 1 through 6, but really I read 1 through 5, and then there's a tiny paragraph that I finished off with. Apparently, this book doesn't count. So the paragraph after it is listed as 1.6. So I guess in this one, I will read from paragraph 6 on through 9. We'll try 9. And I'll have to go back and correct that first video and put 1 through 5. But when we last left off, Thucydides was basically telling us about the different types of people that lived in the ancient Greek world at the time. Parts of Hellas. He talked about the Azolian Locrians, the Aetolians, and so on. So basically, he's just giving the picture of the ancient Greek world, circa the Common Era. So I'm going to go ahead and jump right into paragraph 6, and we'll see what else he has to say. The whole of Hellas used once to carry arms, their habitations being unprotected, and their communication with each other unsafe. Indeed, to wear arms was as much a part of everyday life with them as with the barbarians. And the fact that the people in these parts of Hellas are still living in the old way points to a time when the same mode of life was once equally common to all. The Athenians were the first to lay aside their weapons, to adopt an easier and more luxurious mode of life. Indeed, it is only lately that their rich old men left off the luxury of wearing undergarments of linen, and fastening a knot of their hair with a tie of golden grasshoppers, a fashion which spread to their Ionian kindred, and long prevailed among the old men there. On the contrary, a modest style of dressing, more in conformity with modern ideas, was first adopted by the Spartans, the rich doing their best to assimilate their way of life to that of the common people. They also set the example of contending naked, publicly stripping and anointing themselves with oil in their gymnastic exercises. Formerly, even in the Olympic Games, the athletes who contended wore belts across their middles, and it is but a few years since that the practice ceased. To this day, among some of the barbarians, especially in Asia, when prizes for boxing and wrestling are offered, belts are worn by the combatants. And there are many other points in which a likeness might be shown between the life of the Hellenic world of old and the barbarian of today. This is interesting because, like when I take class in Latin and Greek, they often go back and forth talking about different writers of ancient times and their disdain of anyone who is not Greek or Roman, who they all just basically rack off collectively as barbarians. But here, Thucydides brings comparisons to the Greeks and the outside known world at their time to the barbarians. And I think that's really nice. It's because it shows that there are different viewpoints. It's not just a one-sided view in the ancient world. We tend to get uh, just these sort of vague, broad outlooks on things. I've spoken about this in my other videos where I'm reading Suetonius, where the only thing I ever heard of Julius Caesar most of my life was just he came, he saw, he conquered, he got stabbed to death by his buddies. And that was it. His younger life, through reading Suetonius as the 12 Caesars, is much more fascinating to me. And I think this really catches my eye here, because Thucydides is comparing the barbarians, outsiders here, specifically people in some portion of Asia, with the Hellenic world, and showing that everybody's not that different. There are a lot of customs that are the same. And I don't know, maybe he's even hinting that some of the customs may have come from there or vice versa. Paragraph 7. With respect to their cities later on, at an era of increased facilities of navigation and a greater supply of capital, we find the shores becoming the site of walled cities, and the isthmuses being occupied for the purposes of commerce and defense against a neighbor. But the old cities, on account of the great prevalence of piracy, were built away from the sea, whether on the lands or the continent, and still remain in their old sites. for the pirates used to plunder one another, and indeed all coast populations, whether seafaring or not. Paragraph 8. The islanders, too, were great pirates. These islanders were Carians and Phoenicians, by whom most of the islands were colonized, as was proved by the following fact. During the purification of Delos by Athens in this war, all the graves of the island were taken up, and it was found that above half their inmates were Carians. They were identified by the fashion of the arms buried with them, and by the method of interment, which was the same as the Carians still follow. But as soon as Minos had formed his navy, communication by sea became easier, as he colonized most of the islands and thus expelled the evildoers. The coast populations now began to apply themselves more closely to the acquisition of wealth, and their life became more settled. Some even began to build themselves walls on the strength of their newly acquired riches. For the love of gain would reconcile the weaker to the dominion of the stronger, and the possession of capital enabled the more powerful to reduce the smaller cities to subjection. And it was at a somewhat later stage of this development that they went on the expedition against Troy. Here he's talking about the Trojan War. And also I want to bring up previously in paragraph 6, when he was talking about examples of how the rich were doing certain things to be close to the common people, and also the rich were trying to be like the average person, which is interesting, but also the rich set fashion trends as well in Athens. Um, Apparently, in cities where people got rid of the warlike way, or at least a defensive posture, where the men had to walk around with weapons all the time, and everyone took on a more leisurely pursuit, as he writes. And then they became more concerned with things like fashion, modes of dress, hairstyles, and of course, it's Athens, so probably also theater and philosophy. And paragraph 9. What enabled Agamemnon to raise the armament was more, in my opinion, his superiority in strength than the oaths of Tyndareus, which bound the suitors to follow him. Indeed, the account given by those Peloponnesians who have been the recipients of the most credible tradition is this. First of all, Pelops, arriving from Asia, with vast wealth among a needy population, acquired such power that, stranger though he was, the country was called after him, and this power fortune saw fit materially to increase in the hands of his descendants. Eurystheus had been killed in Attica by the Heraclids. When Eurystheus set out on his expedition to Attica, he committed Mycenae and its government to Atreus, his mother's brother, who had left his father on account of the death of Chrysippus. As time went on and Eurystheus did not return, Atreus complied with the wishes of the Mycenaeans, who were influenced by fear of the Heraclids. Besides, his power seemed considerable, and he had not neglected to seek the favor of the populace, and assumed the role of Mycenae and of the rest of the dominions of Eurystheus. And so the power of the descendants of Pelops came to be greater than that of the descendants of Perseus. To all this Agamemnon succeeded. He had also a navy far stronger than his contemporaries, so that, in my opinion, fear was quite as strong an element as love in the formation of the expedition. The strength of his navy is shown by the fact that his own was the largest contingent, and that of the Arcadians was furnished by him. This at least is what Homer says, if his testimony is deemed sufficient. Besides, in his account of the transmission of the scepter, he calls him of many an isle, and of all Argos, king. Now Agamemnon's was a continental power, and he could not have been master of any except the adjacent islands, and these would not be many, if he had not possessed a fleet. And it's interesting. So earlier when I did the first reading, he spoke about Minos was the first to make a navy. And now Agamemnon has later on, or sometime after, has an even larger navy. And with that, he can now take control of islands in his area, and islands that are adjacent to his territory. But he talks about navies, but I wonder about like merchant fleets, or if they considered them to be like one and the same. I'm going to have to look that up. I also want to look up these Heraclids. I don't think I've heard of them before. I mean, I'm assuming it comes out of Heracles or Hercules, and as the Romans would have called him. And what he talks about, the descendants of Perseus, Yeah, I don't know who those are. I'd like to find out. So I think I'm going to have to make some shorts about them. And I need to make some more shorts about what I read from paragraphs 1 through 5 as well. So I'm going to try to do with the readings is keep these shorter than my previous videos. So I'm going to leave that there. I'm going to go look up some things. Heraclides, Descendants of Perseus, and so on. Maybe even the navies of Minos and Agamemnon. See if I get anything and make shorts out of them. So make sure if you want, you circle back and look for those. Um, but thank you very much. If you've got anything you want to say, or if you've read Thucydides before, um, or if you're a classicist and you want to discuss things, please do. Because like us, if you looked at my channel, you see I'm just a blue collar guy. I'm reading a lot of this for the first time. I take Latin and Greek classes, and I'm very fascinated in this and learning all this as I go. And I'm hoping this reaches other people who are like me, who maybe have liked these sorts of things and who, but have never read them on their own. Um, and maybe want to find some way to get into it. And if these videos help in any way, shape, or form, perfect. That's all for now. I hope you all have a good one, and I'll see you next time.